Thank you very much, Professor March, for your time. I want to start right away with the first question. How do you see the complexities surrounding the conceptualization of Putin's politics, particularly regarding the existence of a coherent Putinism and its ideological syncretism? Does populism play a role in Putin's regime, particularly in the light of its presence within Russian politics and state media environment? What are the main weaknesses and challenges encountered when attempting to classify Putin as either an elitist or a populist leader?
Okay, great question. Putin tries one of the issues is what's been described as kind of paradigmatic pluralism, is the attempt for the president to kind of bridge different kinds of ideologies. And also there's a difference between Putin and what he stands for personally and Putinism as a kind of increasingly kind of monolithic regime ideology. So to some degree, he stands for certain kind of postulates, and they're kind of interpreted in different ways by the media and by different politicians. And there's the nature of his regime means that, you know, he doesn't prescribe kind of to the minutest detail exactly what everyone should say, but he lays out the kind of main parameters, and they're kind of interpreted in a way which can be quite creative and in the media and by divergent politicians, as long as they don't, as long as these people don't kind of fundamentally criticize the nature of the state. So that's kind of problematic in terms of the regime kind of sets out different kinds of ideological. It's kind of eclectic. It adopts different kind of ideologies. It has become more coherent over time around a kind of right-wing nationalism, one could say. And within that role, again, populism does play a role, and it's one of the let's say, ideologies that is used, and it's used in different contexts. It's more used by opposition politicians and the media than it is by Putin personally, although he also tends to use it more in external contexts rather than domestically. One of the fundamental problems is kind of understanding the kind of unwritten laws about Russian politics, and that's kind of very difficult to kind of get a hold of. Increasingly, it's very difficult to research because the politics is kind of very controlled, and so behind all of the different ideologies, the reality is increasing kind of state control, and particularly by the security services. And so that is the kind of thing that kind of any discussion of ideologies needs to take into account. So when we're talking about how Putin uses a certain ideology, the fact that he stands at the head of a kind of controlled state with a kind of increasingly repressive apparatus behind him is important, because it's quite often a subtext. And one of those subtexts is about the kind of, he talks about many things which are contrary to populism, and those include the kind of hierarchy of the state, he will talk in ways which sound populist, which are about respecting the Russian people and being in tune with the Russian people and the Russian people's values and how the Russian people is great and that kind of thing. But simultaneously, he'll talk about, sometimes in coded language, about how loyal they need to be and how they need to respect national interests and how everyone should unite around national interests. And it's people, there's a kind of reciprocal relationship here where the state serves the people, but the people also serve the state. And that is kind of elitist, but elitist doesn't really capture the entirety of it, because the elitist element is not really reflected in a reflection of a kind of open discussion of the Russian elite being better, for example, than the people, or it's not really borne out in the way that it was in the Bolshevik period, where you had a kind of leading and guiding role of the party. It's again more of a subtext about how the state is the kind of unifier of the people and the elite, and people should kind of obey the elite because they represent the state. So it's about these kind of open and coded messages, and how the kind of authorities kind of oscillate behind them and use different aspects at different times. So I think one of the problems about populism is in regards to Putin is it's a partial capture of what's going on, but it's used in kind of quite distinct ways within the Russian context.
All right. In terms of leadership style, Putin has usually been described as exhibiting a bad boy populist persona. How does this persona align with or diverge from traditional populist leadership styles, and what are its implications for understanding his political strategy? Moreover, how does Putin's leadership fit into charismatic leadership framework, considering his reliance on incumbency advantages, control of mobilization, and aversion to popular spontaneity?
Yeah, it's an element again of significant complexity. If you look at it on the face of it, he's got lots of commonalities with other so-called bad boys or kind of disruptive populist leaders like Trump, Bolsonaro, etc., particularly right-wing ones, because it's based around a kind of macho strongman image, someone who can be a little bit coarse, makes sexist jokes. It really emphasizes kind of patriarchal kind of politics and kind of has kind of superhuman feats. Again, it's a very partial capture of what Putin's doing, because we in the West tend to focus on these images and sometimes laugh at them, particularly in the UK, where we don't have a very deferent view of our leadership. But there's a lot more going on there, and and a lot of the time Putin actually acts in a very kind of sober, restrained, kind of sometimes a military leader, but quite often a kind of business-like CEO, and a kind of restrained. I mean, the czar is sometimes used, and sometimes he'll use the pageantry of the state, but a lot of the time he'll be a kind of sober, kind of in his business suit, fairly laconic, less emotional style. Not prone to the kind of outbursts that you see. So again, he can play the kind of populist role when he wants, but he has this other role, and again, understanding that he's a representative of the security services and the Soviet state is important. So when he makes certain kinds of kind of macho language and kind of threats, it has a kind of subtext about what he represents and the kind of real menace behind it. And we know that he has changed over the course of the last couple of decades, but the repressiveness is becoming much more apparent. In terms of charisma, again, he clearly exudes some kind of charismatic authority, but this is in terms of he's undoubtedly very popular, and a lot of the popularity is vested in him as the person who's above the party system, and he's seen as in many ways as kind of essential in the Russian discourse to the creation of the Russian state. Again, kind of a lot of this is kind of carried out by people, not Putin personally, but by people who kind of act on his behalf, who say, well, Putin, we need Putin, and we can't see the Russian state without Putin, and the head of the Russian Orthodox Church saying he's a miracle of God and things. So there's a kind of mini personality cult that he doesn't directly stand for, and he tends to kind of dismiss this and act in a very kind of he's like teetotal, non-drinker, kind of sober type personality, but he leaves other people to kind of present him as a Superman. So it's again the kind of complexities of partially populist, but many other things as well.
All right. In one of your articles, you discussed the impact of Putin's intervention in Crimea, and of course, intervention in Ukraine now, on domestic political situation in Russia, particularly regarding the marginalization of non-systemic opposition groups. Could you elaborate on how this crisis has affected the dynamics between the Kremlin and both systemic and non-systemic opposition movements in Russia?
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's contributed to the crushing of the opposition. There's no opposition as such anymore. There's individuals, but they have kind of no structure. Most of the non-systemic opposition has been exiled or exiled themselves, or been arrested, or in the case of Navalny, has died. the major thing was that it boosted Putin's popularity. It kind of co-opted the Russian nationalists, and Putin has kind of really presented himself as much more of a nationalist and again the kind of gatherer of the Russian territories and the Russian lands, and allowed him to present himself as a kind of historical figure who's making Russia great again. That made it very difficult for people to criticize him, but it also kind of built into this kind of rally around the flag effect, where it reinforces the sense that people who criticize him are traitors, and that partly because it's resulted in a much worse international environment, certainly vis-a-vis the West, it has allowed him to portray the domestic opposition as kind of traitors or kind of pro-Western fifth column. And this was alongside the so-called conservative turn in Russian politics, where he has become much more conservative nationalist. And essentially, that started depriving the opposition of a voice, and it's been backed up with a lot of legal restrictions on opposition, and these were again kind of reinforced after February 2022 with kind of bans on being able to criticize the so-called special military operation. So essentially the kind of ideological and rhetorical space for opposition has declined alongside the legal space for opposition, and it's clearly boosted Putin's popularity, but alongside it's boosted repression. So you don't really have any, and you see that in the upcoming election, those which stand for this kind of systemic opposition, they really don't verbalize any political critique of Putin whatsoever.
In your article, Putin, populist, anti-populist, or pseudo-populist, you argue that Putin's ideology subverts populism, using populist ideas and rhetoric in service of authoritarian state. Also, you argue against characterizing Putin as substantively populist. Could you elaborate on why you don't see Putin as a populist leader, particularly in terms of his approach to people-centrism, anti-elitism, and popular sovereignty?
On one hand, those elements are there, and I think, like I say, Putin can play the populist where he needs to. On the other hand, consistent with my other answers, it's just a very partial capture of a lot of the rhetoric that Putin is standing for, and a lot of the other elements of ideology are more important: the statism, conservatism, those kind of issues. As well, Putin is fundamentally anti-mobilizational, and this is consistent with his politics from a very early stage, and arguably his psychology as someone who came out of the GDR as a security service agent who saw the wall collapse. He's fundamentally averse to any kind of popular mobilization, certainly against the elite, but fundamentally suspicious of any popular mobilization at all. So where he uses elements of populism, they're rather disconnected. Like I say, if he focuses on people-centrism, it's not normally connected to anti-elitism. Where he focuses on anti-elitism, it's almost universally focused either on the past, i.e. the Bolsheviks, and his rhetoric over Ukraine is quite important, where he talks about how the Bolsheviks kind of drew up Ukraine against the wishes of the Russian people. But conversely, it's also focused outside, so it'll be focused on Ukrainian elites or Western elites. But at no point is that kind of critique really of Western elites tied to a kind of vision of kind of popular sovereignty as well. So they're not tied together in the kind of fundamental way that you'd expect of a populist. He's not standing for people power everywhere. He will talk in nebulous terms about kind of fighting for the underdog globally and about the nefarious Western elites. But this is kind of, it's much more of a kind of horizontal critique against outsiders than it is as a vertical critique from the people upwards against the elite. And that's also true when the most obvious use of populism is in Ukraine, where he criticizes the kind of junta, the coup, which is the way he describes what's happened in Ukraine, but he's not calling for the Ukrainian people to be empowered as a result of power being taken from them by the coup. He's asking for the Ukrainian people to look to the Russian people for protection against the West. So again, the way in which it used is much more in the service of a kind of anti-Western critique than it is of a genuine populism. Again, there will be people around the Kremlin who use a more populist critique, and I think elements of that are clearly designed to, consciously or not, to resonate amongst populists abroad. But fundamentally, as the core of what Putin's trying to do, he's much more about top-down control and centralization and keeping the people kind of quiet than he is about giving them any kind of authority.
You discussed the concept of official nationality in Russia, emphasizing its moderate conservatism and promotion of civic nationalism. How does the Kremlin balance the promotion of this ideology with the need to control more extreme forms of nationalism, particularly those that may challenge its authority? Can you elaborate on how the Kremlin strategically employs nationalism to garner support and suppress dissent, and how effective has this approach been in preserving the elite power?
Yeah, it's a balance which they have oscillated between. If you look at the Kremlin's rhetoric, particularly people like the foreign minister Lavrov, and people around Putin, it is generally, at least until the last decade, been fairly sober, realist, and based on, again, state interests. Over time, the balance between this kind of official nationality and the nationality of and the nationalism of nationalists within Russia has become a bit more permeable because, again, consonant with the war on Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, the Kremlin's drawn much more on the domestic nationalist consensus, and it's become, like 15 years ago, you'd have said Putin was probably kind of pro-European, maybe critical of the US, but certainly in the last decade, it's become much more a kind of anti-Western, kind of critical of Western liberalism, so-called woke politics, those kind of things. So to some degree, I think the official nationality has become more nationalistic, and Putin has kind of co-opted some of the domestic nationalists, so that the kind of people who used to be seen on the extreme, like Alexander Dugin, their ideas have become much more part of the mainstream, certainly part of the media mainstream, and particularly in the context of the current conflict. Then a lot of the people speaking on Russian TV are, as kind of mainstream pundits, are kind of very overtly nationalistic and kind of talking about the potential extermination of Ukraine as a nation. I think relative to those, Putin's rhetoric is still sober and more restrained, and he'll still talk in terms of kind of peace deals and things. But the kind of way in which the Kremlin has let the nationalists kind of dominate the kind of political environment shows that official nationality, it's become much more about a clash of civilizations between Russia and the West, and the sense in which it's still fairly moderate. It's become more, I would say, it's become more extreme over time.
In one of your articles, you draw parallels between the dystopian depiction of political control in the Hunger Games and the situation in Russia, where opposition parties are manipulated to reinforce the Kremlin's authority. How do these manipulations manifest in the political landscape, and what strategies does the Kremlin employ to maintain control over opposition activities? Furthermore, what factors could undermine Putin's support in the long term, and how might the opposition capitalize on the systemic vulnerabilities to challenge Putin's regime?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole kind of underworld of control of the party system that is that's kind of channeled through people like Sergei Kirienko and the presidential administration, and previously it was Vladimir Selcuk. It is extremely difficult to read that, as you might imagine, because it's informal, and you're relying very much on circumstantial accounts through kind of Russian political scientists and the Russian media, and those people aren't as open as they used to be. So the big caveat in answering that question is ultimately we don't really know, but things kind of seep out. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a consortium of Western media that released released a report called Kremlin Leaks, which was about the kind of informal ways in which the Kremlin funnels money into kind of propagandists, into media realm, into education. What they tend to do vis-a-vis the opposition, they don't want to they don't want elections which they have to kind of overtly and coarsely rig. They want the electorate to be pushed in making the right choice in advance. And none of this is to say Putin wouldn't win a free and fair election, but a free and fair election would have a totally different dynamic. So they kind of control the narrative before the election. They they kind of put pressure on the parties to select their own candidates beforehand and to do it in a way that is not really challenging to the Kremlin. And one of the big examples here is the communists, who in the 2018 election, they ran a businessman called Pavel Grudinin, who got 11% of the vote, and 11% is not particularly impressive. But he was starting to get a little bit of traction, and after the presidential election, he became a kind of national scale political figure and potentially one of the leaders of the future leaders of the Communist Party. And then after that, through various kind of subterfuges, he was kind of his business was attacked, and he fell out with his family, and he was kind of driven from politics. So that's kind of one example of the way these things happen. So I already mentioned there's a lot of regulation and increasing restrictions on kind of street protest, and now any kind of protest about the war. So that's one thing, but also the message that the Kremlin sends through things like allegedly assassinating Navalny, those kind of things, those send a message about the limits of what is achievable. So over time, the opposition politicians, the kind of people who carry on protesting, have to be immensely brave and committed. And a lot of politicians just self-censor or take decisions whereby they don't really challenge anything fundamental. For a long time, no opposition politician of any kind of major scale has fundamentally criticized Russian foreign policy. Like the original annexation of Crimea was agreed 449-1, I think, in the Russian parliament, and the one politician who opposed it, Ilya Ponomaryov, he then had to go to exile in Ukraine. So the kind of general direction's been very clear for a while. Through informal and formal means, it's extremely difficult to actually express any opposition.
Referring to one of your surveys, how do Russian policymaking and academic elites conceptualize the idea of radicalization within the context of Islam, and what are the key factors they identify as contributing to this phenomenon? How does Russia's approach to combating radicalization domestically influence its foreign policy towards the Muslim world?
Yeah, the concept of radicalization is more I think it's more popular in Western circles and UK circles than it is in Russia in terms of that particular formulation, although it has been used. Over time, the concept of radicalization has tended to be subsumed to that of extremism, which has been used in a fairly heavy-handed way to restrict kind of alternative or inconvenient views of the state. In general, the state policymakers and their formulation of Islam has distinguished between what they see as kind of traditional domestic Islam and largely foreign orientated, but more kind of radical or extremist Islam. So they've made that distinction. And again, this is constant with this kind of retraditionalization, reconservatism of Russian politics, where Russia is in favor of still a multiplicity of traditions, as long as they can be seen as kind of domestic. So that has tended to result in a fostering and channeling money and support to the kind of domestic leaders of Islam, and kind of trying to limit foreign contacts, particularly in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, etc., with so-called Wahhabism. That's one thing, and the other, in terms of the critique of what's going on in terms of radicalization processes, the Russian discussion about Islam has tended to be focused more on kind of the socio-economic causes of Islamic radicalization in terms of poverty and youth unemployment and those kind of things than about any kind of political underpinnings to the rise of more radical Islam. And that's a difference from kind of Western approaches. Western approaches to why Russia has had problems with radical Islam would focus on issues of corruption, issues of governance, issues of centralization, and focus on how Islam has kind of played a role as a kind of ideology of opposition, which allows particularly disaffected youth to express a kind of radical opposition to the state. From the Russian official point of view, they would not focus on that aspect at all. It's kind of it's kind of a bit taboo. They focus on, again, poverty, youth unemployment, and their policies would then be focused on increasing the socioeconomic, like pouring money into regions to make them less vulnerable to that kind of thing, which is an important part of dealing with that issue. At the same time, there's kind of there's policies of co-option, so kind of pouring money and support to loyalist supporters. And the biggest example of that is in Chechnya, where Ramzan Kadyrov promotes this kind of syncretic kind of domestic Islam, which is kind of a little bit dubious in terms of its historical basis, but he's seen there as kind of co-opting that. And in terms of foreign policy, again, part of the co-option element, Russia has kind of presented itself as a kind of Muslim power and friendly to the Arab world, and increasingly, particularly once it's dealt with the issues in Chechnya, as somewhere, as a kind of genuine home to Muslims. So and that can also over time be linked to a kind of the general pivot away from Western politics and towards kind of multipolar politics as well. So there's that element as well. So the more there's been more domestic control there, the more comfortable Russia feels about presenting itself as a kind of friendly face to kind of to the Arab world.
There's a widely observed trend of support from Putin's Russia towards populist extreme right-wing parties globally. How do you explain this relationship, and what factors drive Putin to support these parties? Are these connections primarily ideational or opportunistic in nature? How has this relationship been influenced by Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. In general, I would say that Russia's relations with forces outside its borders is more opportunistic than anything else, because it picks friends in all kinds of places for all kinds of reasons, and that includes the radical left, and that includes kind of politicians in the mainstream. So it can be it's kind of whatever works, and it will pivot its message towards what is most attractive and kind of what the audience wants to hear. With the populist right in particular, there is more of an ideational component, and that has grown over time, and that again is linked to Putin's domestic conservatism. So it's around traditional values, family values, church, strong leadership. So in terms of a kind of positive attraction. In terms of kind of common enemies, it's linked around, again, American hegemony, kind of postmodern kind of liberalism generally, the EU as a kind of supranational actor. So there is a core of the opportunism and the ideology come together with the radical right. So I would say the links between the radical right and Putin are probably stronger than with the radical left, who might share kind of common anti-Americanism, anti-imperialism, but the radical left is more critical of the domestic model in Russia, whereas a lot of the radical right are quite like Putin as a kind of strong macho leader. The Ukraine war has complicated that, no doubt, and it's made kind of certainly within Western Europe, it's made an overtly pro-Putin position a little bit more taboo. And that said, the radical right in Europe is quite divided geographically about whether it how much it likes Russia or not. And if take the kind of true Finns, for example, in Finland, then they wouldn't have been pro-Putin. So they've kind of had to kind of do a bit of a step back and about face. But I think these things are still very much in motion. We know that the war is by no means finished. We don't know who's going to win or if anyone's going to win. And I think those kind of constellations mean that the final destination isn't really settled. And you will find, I think, some of the ones who are more hesitant about their position over Putin may start to creep back towards that position over time in terms of like supporting a peace deal on one hand, and being implicitly or explicitly critical of Western policies and arming them and sanctions and those kind of things. And obviously, if Trump wins in November, then that's going to be a big boost to the populist right, and they will start to look towards these. If Trump carries through on his kind of anti-NATO policies and his defunding Ukraine and things, then that's going to definitely boost the radical rights. They'll start to some of them will start to reorientate back towards Russia and start to echo some of the talking points, I think. So very much in motion.
All right. What is your interpretation of the recent death of Alexei Navalny in prison? How does it reflect on the nature of Putin's regime?
There's a lot we don't know and we'll never know. I think we won't know exactly why or how he died. We don't know whether that's someone high up, maybe Putin himself, maybe someone close to him saying, right, bump him off. Or we don't know whether it's the sustained maltreatment in the prison because he was going to worse and worse prison regimes. His health was under threat. And there is a story doing the rounds, and again, I have no way of knowing whether it's true. There's a story saying that he was due to be exchanged as part of a prisoner exchange, and that was maybe a trigger because the people in the Kremlin thought, actually, no, we can't exchange him. Let's take this out of the reckoning. We don't know all of that kind of thing, but I think it sends a message, and if we think back to some of my answers here, it's a kind of major indicator of the changing trends of in Russian politics, because just over a decade ago, Navalny was given relatively free rein. He could voice he wasn't given access to kind of state TV or anything like that, but he was allowed to operate. Occasionally he would be arrested or warned or things, but he was allowed to run in the Moscow mayoral elections in 2013. He got 29%. He was strong, and so he was. It was then I think the Kremlin considered, right, we can kind of control him, we can co-opt him, we've got nothing really to fear. But over time, and they've become much more restrictive, and then he's not allowed to run in 2018, and then obviously there's an attempt on his life and he's in prison. So it's a sign of the kind of increasing repressiveness and the lack of any kind of real tolerance for even limited opposition, because I mean how big a threat was Navalny? We'll never know. It was a potential threat, but in reality, in terms of, he was never, you can see a scenario where he never managed to be that popular for whatever reason. It wasn't like he was a candidate who won an election and was a kind of ever an alternative president. It was all more potentiality. But I think by arresting him, by kind of rounding him up, and then kind of the death shows that repressiveness, but it also sends the message of there isn't really any hope. So it's a kind of real Navalny represented, whatever you think about his slightly controversial politics, he represented the sense that you don't need to be afraid of the Kremlin, and you can laugh at them as well, and they don't like being laughed at. So and you can kind of really focus on some of the critical issues like corruption. But killing him crushes hope, and it also sends a message that kind of prison isn't the end. So if anyone is kind of incentivized to stand up against the Kremlin, then you will go to jail, but don't think that that's necessarily going to be the worst of what happens to you. I think it's about absolutely crushing opposition. It also sends a message to the West: we don't care. We don't care what you think. You don't care about Nobel Prizes or prominent oppositionists or anything like that. So it's a kind of sign of, I think some people have said, well, this shows Putin's afraid of Navalny. I don't think so. I think he would have regarded him as a irritant, and maybe the people around him would have said he's a potential threat if we let him get out of hand. But Putin personally just thinks, yeah, I'll crush him, and I don't care. So it's that kind of impunity of power. And I think if you want to see the thread in some of my earlier answers, it's about, one of the key things here is about the way that in which state power and the kind of violence of state power has become much more dominant in Russian politics in the last kind of decade and a half.
All right. And lastly, Professor March, regarding the upcoming presidential elections next week, do you anticipate any surprises, or do you believe it's another milestone in the consolidation of Putin's authoritarian rule?
It's definitely the latter, and I think if we have any surprises or intrigues, they are minor kind of curiosities, really. The kind of big intrigues might be whether the Liberal candidate Vladislav Devankov, whether he gets second ahead of the communists. But if he gets second, it'll be 7, 8, 9%, maybe not even that. It won't be big. Again, like this election's even less competitive than the previous ones. You have 3 candidates plus Putin, whereas you had 8 candidates 6 years ago. None of them are really standing for anything very substantive. The communists have put forward a secondary candidate who also ran 20 years ago and was seen as a kind of weak candidate then. And like I said, the election's kind of pre-rigged, so you know, the Kremlin's increasingly relying on kind of internet voting and kind of electronic voting, which isn't scrutinized. So it will get the result that it wants. And the talk has been that Putin will get 80% and that was apparently a source in the Kremlin last year. If Putin gets 80, 85%, it wouldn't surprise me. That gives no space for any opposition. Again, the elections play a functional role in reinforcing Putin's role as a kind of arbiter and a patron of the elites. So the message he'll want to send is he's not challengeable for the foreseeable future, and that people can run against him, but they'll get crushed. And I wouldn't expect to see anything different. I think your earlier question talked about weaknesses in the future. I think we mustn't forget that there are kind of weaknesses in the Russian political system caused by the economy, the loss of life in the war, inflation, those kind of things. Those kind of pressures are there, and they're unpredictable, and they may have an outcome. But what is being done is to make sure that there's no kind of political force that can mobilize on any kind of grievance at the moment. And so far, the Kremlin's been pretty successful at that.
Professor March, thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
I appreciate your time.
Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Very best. All the best.
And to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.